Story 1. I had just finished a grueling day, my mind heavy from the weight of tasks that seemed to stretch endlessly. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that amplified even the smallest sounds. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen felt almost oppressive. I collapsed onto the couch, phone in hand, scrolling aimlessly through the glowing screen, trying to shake the day's exhaustion before heading to bed. As I swiped mindlessly, a notification appeared at the top of the screen, sharp against the dim light of the room. A text message. From an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won, and I tapped it open. The message was short, stark, and chilling. "You'll regret this." The words sent a jolt through me, my body tensing involuntarily. I stared at the screen, rereading the message over and over as the knot in my stomach tightened. My thoughts began to race, grasping for an explanation, a meaning. Then, it hit me. This wasn't just any unknown number. It was my ex. I hadn't heard from him in months. Not since the breakup, the messy, painful end that I had fought to put behind me. After everything, I thought I was free of him, that the distance and time had built a wall he couldn't cross. But here he was, resurfacing like a phantom in the dark, armed with nothing but a string of words that made the air feel colder. My mind reeled as memories clawed their way to the surface. I hadn't expected to hear from him. Not now. Not ever. And certainly not like this. There were no apologies, no olive branch. Just a threat. Or was it a warning? I stood up, pacing the room as the weight of his message pressed against me. What did he mean? What did he think I'd regret? Ending things? Moving on? Or was there something more, something I couldn't yet see but would soon come to understand? I glanced at my phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen as I debated whether to respond. I hated that even now, after everything, he still had this power over me. With just 4 words, he had unraveled months of hard-fought peace. My better judgment screamed at me to leave it alone. Engaging would only feed the fire. But my curiosity whispered back, insidious and persistent. What if ignoring him made it worse? What if he had more to say, something darker, something that wouldn't stop with a single message? The hours dragged on as I sat there, torn between action and inaction. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air growing thick and suffocating as his words repeated in my mind like a haunting melody. "You'll regret this." Finally, with a deep breath, I decided to block the number. My finger hovered over the button for a moment before I pressed it, feeling a fleeting sense of relief. It was over, I told myself. He couldn't reach me anymore. But as the silence settled back into the room, a flicker of doubt wormed its way into my mind. Was it really over? Or had I just escalated things? That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts twisted and turned like shadows on the wall. Sleep refused to come. Every creak of the house felt magnified, every shift of darkness outside the window seemed alive with movement. His message clung to me like a phantom, the words taking on a weight they hadn't had before. The days that followed were no better. I buried myself in distractions, trying to outrun the unease. But the fear lingered, creeping in during quiet moments like a presence just out of sight. Every time my phone buzzed, my chest tightened, expecting another message. Yet none came. The silence should have been a comfort, but it wasn't. It felt calculated. And then it happened. One evening, as I walked home from work, I saw him. It was just a fleeting glimpse, a figure standing in the shadows across the street. My breath hitched, my steps faltered. My eyes darted back to the spot, but he was already gone. Had I imagined it? I told myself I had. I had to. But the tightness in my chest wouldn't ease, and every instinct screamed that it had been him. He was watching me. Waiting. The fear I'd been holding at bay came crashing down, suffocating me. His message wasn't just words, it was a promise, one he intended to keep. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the shadows, my phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I had tried to escape him, to rebuild my life without the chaos he had brought, but he had found a way back in. And as the hours dragged on, one thought consumed me: he had been right. I regretted it all. Not leaving him, that was the only decision I'd never second guess. But I regretted underestimating him, thinking I could put him behind me so easily. But this time, I wouldn't run. This time, I would face him. Whatever he had planned, whatever darkness he intended to unleash, I would meet it head on. Because I couldn't let him take my peace. Not again. Story 2. It started as an ordinary morning. I was scrolling through my phone, half-focused, checking messages and reminders to prepare for the day ahead. As I flipped through the apps, my eyes landed on something that made me pause, a note titled Daily Routine in my Notes app. I didn't remember writing it, but it didn't seem strange at first. Maybe it was an old list I had forgotten about, I thought. Curiosity tugged at me, and I opened it. That's when the unease began. At first glance, the list seemed mundane, filled with typical tasks: wake up at 7 a.m., coffee at 7:30 a.m., work by 9 a.m. But as I scrolled further, my stomach began to twist. The tasks were no longer familiar. Take a walk at 11 a.m., I had no habit of walking at that time. Appointment at 2 p.m. with Sam. Sam. Who was Sam? I couldn't recall ever scheduling something like that. My palms grew clammy as I read on. The list continued with unsettling specificity: pick up package at 4 p.m., call mom at 5 p.m. The problem was, I hadn't ordered anything, and I hadn't planned to call my mom today. Each item felt like a glimpse into a day that wasn't mine but somehow was. By the time I reached the final entry, I felt the air catch in my lungs: look in the basement at 9 p.m. My basement? I hadn't set foot down there in weeks. I closed the app, my hands trembling. Maybe I had written it in my sleep, I thought, or perhaps someone had added it without my knowledge. But who? And why? Hoping to dismiss my spiraling thoughts, I reopened the list, hoping to find some clue, some rational explanation. But the more I read, the more disoriented I felt. Even the tasks that seemed plausible were wrong in subtle, uncanny ways. A dinner at 7 p.m. with a friend I hadn't spoken to in weeks. It was like the list was a distorted reflection of my life, familiar yet alien. Then my phone buzzed. A calendar notification popped up. It was a reminder for the 2 p.m. appointment, complete with a location, a coffee shop I'd never heard of. The entry was precise, even including directions. My heart raced. How had it ended up in my calendar? My thoughts scrambled for answers, but none came. I called my best friend, hoping they'd reassure me, maybe even laugh it off. The phone rang, but there was no answer. Instead, a voicemail appeared. I played it, my breath hitching as I listened. The voice was unfamiliar, calm yet unnervingly cold. You've been following the list. Keep it up, and you'll be fine. My blood turned to ice. How did they know? Who were they? I glanced at the clock. It was already 2 p.m., the time for the appointment. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to pretend none of this was happening. But deep down, a sinister compulsion stirred, pulling me toward the list. The hours crawled by. I tried to distract myself, to shake off the invisible tether that seemed to tie me to the tasks. But the more I resisted, the stronger the pull became. By 9 p.m., I couldn't fight it anymore. My body felt like it was moving on its own as I approached the basement door, my hand trembling as I grasped the cold doorknob. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing down on me like a weight. I opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing through the stillness. The basement was a void, dark and cold, the air thick with an oppressive energy. Each step down the wooden staircase felt heavier than the last, the sound of my footfalls swallowed by the quiet. When I reached the bottom, I fumbled for the light switch. The bulb flickered before casting a dim, weak glow over the room. At first, it seemed empty. Just the usual clutter, old boxes, forgotten furniture, and dust-covered corners. I let out a shaky breath, relief threatening to bubble up, until I saw it. A single piece of paper, sitting perfectly in the center of the floor. My legs felt like they might give out as I approached it. The handwriting was the same as the list. I picked it up, my hands shaking so hard I could barely read the words scrawled across it. Well done. Now you can leave. Leave? Leave what? My house? My life? The question echoed in my mind as panic set in. I bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My phone buzzed again. It was my best friend calling back. But I couldn't answer. What could I even say? The list, the voice, the note, it was all too much. I locked every door, turned off every light, and sat in the dark, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The silence around me felt suffocating, yet the words from the note screamed in my ears, now you can leave. I stared at the phone, dreading the next notification, the next task. My life was no longer my own, and I had no idea who, or what, was pulling the strings. All I could do was wait, paralyzed by fear, knowing deep down that the list wasn't finished. Something else was coming. And whatever it was, I wasn't sure I'd survive it. Story 3. The exhaustion of the day weighed on me as I finally climbed into bed, placing my phone on the nightstand as I always did. The soft glow of the screen cast faint light across the room before dimming into darkness. I lay there, cocooned in the quiet stillness of the night, with the gentle hum of the air conditioner serving as a lullaby. Slowly, my thoughts faded, and sleep took over. When I woke up the next morning, the sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and inviting. I stretched, feeling the ache of yesterday's toil in my muscles, and instinctively reached for my phone. But my fingers met only the cool surface of the nightstand. My phone wasn't there. A jolt of confusion shot through me as I sat up, scanning the room. I checked the floor, beneath the bed, even the small space between the nightstand and the wall, nothing. My heartbeat quickened, a faint whisper of panic creeping into my chest. Where was it? I replayed the night in my head. I had placed it there, right there, before I drifted off. I was certain of it. Desperate, I ventured out of the bedroom, checking every possible spot. And then, in the kitchen, I froze. There it was. My phone. Sitting neatly on the counter, as if it had been deliberately placed there. My stomach churned. I hadn't been in the kitchen all night, or at least, I didn't think I had. Was I sleepwalking? The idea felt absurd. I didn't have a history of it. Or, had someone been in my house? The thought crawled up my spine like icy fingers, but there were no signs of forced entry. No open windows. Nothing. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling slightly as I checked the screen for clues. Everything was normal. The apps, the messages, the time, it was all exactly as I had left it. But that knot of unease in my chest tightened. Something wasn't right. The rest of the day passed in a fog of confusion and uneasiness. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a bizarre accident. Maybe I had moved it without realizing. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was toying with me. That night, I placed the phone on the nightstand again, deliberately noting its position before climbing into bed. I promised myself I wouldn't let my imagination get the better of me. It was just one of those odd things I'd laugh about later. But when I woke up, the phone was gone again. My pulse thundered in my ears as I bolted out of bed, a sinking dread coiling in my stomach. I raced to the kitchen. And there it was. Sitting on the counter. Again. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something I could explain away. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone, my mind whirling with questions. How was this happening? Was someone, or something, moving it? Desperation clawed at me. That night, I set up a small camera in my bedroom, determined to get answers. I needed to know what was happening, even if the truth terrified me. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind, set my nerves on edge. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were restless, filled with shadows and fleeting glimpses of movement. The next morning, I rushed to check the footage. My fingers shook as I hit play. The video showed me sleeping peacefully, the rise and fall of my breath steady. But then, the phone moved. It slid out of the room, disappearing into the hallway. I sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief, the world tilting beneath me. There was no one else in the footage. No one had entered the room. The phone hadn't just fallen, it had traveled. A cold, creeping realization settled over me. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something I could ignore or explain away. Whatever was behind this, it wasn't finished. And it was only getting started. Story 4. The night started innocently enough, a quiet evening where the stillness of the house wrapped itself around me like a heavy blanket. I was lying in bed, the soft hum of the heater in the background, drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but as my awareness sharpened, I couldn't mistake it, the sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They moved with a rhythm too calculated to be the house settling, too steady to be a figment of my imagination. My chest tightened as my heart began to pound, each beat echoing louder in the suffocating silence. I held my breath, straining to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It was coming from somewhere in the house. Someone was walking. My stomach churned as the reality settled in, I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. Sliding out of bed as quietly as I could, I felt every nerve in my body go rigid. The floor beneath my feet was icy, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. Each step I took down the hallway felt like a betrayal, the creak of the floorboards threatening to give me away. The footsteps continued, faint but unrelenting, each one a reminder that I wasn't imagining things. They were real. And they were moving. I crept down the stairs, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back, to hide, to do anything but follow the sound. But curiosity, or perhaps fear, drove me forward. The house was cloaked in shadows, the faint glow of moonlight through the windows barely illuminating the space. The footsteps were louder now, coming from the kitchen. My pulse quickened, and my breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as I approached the doorway. The kitchen was empty. I stood there, frozen, my eyes darting across the room. Everything was exactly as I had left it, no drawers ajar, no chairs out of place. And yet, the feeling that someone had been there, or worse, still was overwhelming. I leaned against the doorway, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing, a trick of my tired mind, perhaps. But then, I heard it again. This time, it was behind me. The soft tap of shoes against the hardwood floor sent a shiver down my spine. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the hallway was empty. The air felt heavier now, oppressive, as though the shadows themselves were pressing in on me. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed with a fear I hadn't known before. Reaching into my pocket, I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed my friend's number. When they answered, I could barely manage a whisper. "I think someone's in my house," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of my terror. "I can hear footsteps, but I don't see anyone." My friend's voice was calm, trying to reassure me. They urged me to check the doors, the windows, to make sure everything was locked. But everything already was. The deadbolt on the front door was secure, the windows latched tightly. There was no sign of forced entry. And yet, the sound of footsteps had been undeniable. I moved through the house, phone in hand, my friend's voice a distant comfort in my ear. Each door I opened felt like stepping into the unknown, my breath catching as I braced for what might be on the other side. But every room was empty, untouched. The silence was almost deafening now, a suffocating reminder of how alone I truly was. Or was I? After what felt like hours, I returned to the living room, sinking onto the couch with my phone still clutched tightly in my hand. My mind raced, replaying the sound of those footsteps, the weight of each one seeming to echo in my memory. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe. That's when I saw it. On the coffee table, a piece of paper sat where nothing had been before. My blood ran cold as I picked it up, my hands trembling so violently I could barely unfold it. The handwriting was crude, uneven, as though written in a rush. 3 words stared back at me, each one dripping with malice. I'm here. The chill that had been creeping through me earlier now gripped my entire body. My vision blurred, my pulse thundered in my ears, and my thoughts spiraled into chaos. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me, walked through my home, and left this note as a chilling reminder of their presence. I stumbled to the front door, checking the lock again, my shaking hands verifying what I already knew, it was secure. How could someone have gotten in? How had they left without me noticing? The questions swirled in my mind, but no answers came. Only the overwhelming, suffocating fear that they could still be here, hiding, waiting. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind outside making my heart leap into my throat. By morning, the house was bathed in sunlight, but the warmth did little to dispel the unease. I searched the house again, but nothing was out of place. Nothing except the note, which remained on the table like a taunt. It's been days now, but I can't shake the feeling. Every shadow in the corner of my vision, every faint sound in the stillness of the night, it all feels like a reminder that whoever, or whatever, was here hasn't left. They're waiting. Watching. And I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. Story 5. It was late, the kind of night where silence wraps itself around you like a heavy blanket. I was getting ready for bed, moving through the familiar rhythm of my nightly routine, when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. The gentle glide of paper sliding across the floor. It was so subtle I almost dismissed it as my imagination, but something about the stillness that followed made me freeze. For a moment, I stood there, heart thudding in my chest, straining my ears for any other sound. None came. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to move. I approached the door cautiously, each step weighed down with a growing sense of unease. Kneeling, I saw it, a letter. Plain, unmarked, and tucked just inside the edge of the door. A chill ran down my spine as I reached for it, my fingers hesitant, trembling. The paper felt unnaturally cold, as if it carried the chill of whoever had delivered it. Slowly, I unfolded it, the silence around me seeming to stretch and amplify the crinkle of the paper. There were only a few words, written in stark, bold handwriting, I know where you are. My stomach dropped. The message was so simple, but the weight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at the letter, trying to make sense of it, but all I could feel was the icy grip of fear tightening around my chest. Someone knew where I lived. Someone had been close enough to slip this under my door. My sanctuary, the place I felt safest, suddenly felt exposed, violated. I scrambled to the door, checking the lock, my breath hitching as I peered out the peephole. The hallway was empty. Quiet. Too quiet. I moved to the window, expecting, no, dreading, to see someone watching me. But the night was still, the darkness pressing in against the glass like a living thing. The streetlights outside flickered faintly, their glow offering little comfort. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. My mind raced with questions. Who could have done this? Why? Had someone been watching me all along? I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone left me a vague, ominous note. It sounded absurd. But the fear was real. The message wasn't random, it was deliberate, calculated. Whoever sent it wasn't playing games. I tried to rationalize, to think of anyone who might hold a grudge or have a reason to scare me. But my life was unremarkable. Normal. Or at least, it had been until tonight. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in around me. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my keys and phone, desperate to leave, to get away. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. What if someone was waiting for me outside? What if I was walking straight into a trap? My hand trembled as I forced myself to open the door. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and lifeless. The parking lot beyond was the same, desolate, bathed in flickering yellow light. But the feeling of being hunted clung to me, an invisible presence pressing down on my shoulders. I walked quickly, trying to stay composed, but every shadow felt like it was reaching for me. The cold night air bit at my skin as I made my way down the street, glancing over my shoulder with every other step. The streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, their light casting long, distorted shadows that danced with my every move. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, faint and measured, but when I turned, there was no one there. Eventually, I found myself at a diner. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its light a weak beacon of normalcy in the oppressive darkness. Inside, I sat in a booth near the door, ordering coffee I couldn't drink. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every time the door swung open, my eyes darted to it, scanning the faces of strangers, looking for something, or someone, familiar. But no answers came. Only the growing realization that whoever sent that letter wasn't done with me. I was being watched. I was being hunted. Hours later, I forced myself to go back. I couldn't hide forever. The apartment was as I'd left it, eerily quiet, the air thick with the tension of unanswered questions. I locked the door behind me and checked every room, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. But the sense of unease lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on me. The letter was still on the table where I'd left it, its bold message taunting me. I sat down, my head in my hands, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. My breath hitched as I opened it, dread pooling in my stomach. I know where you are. And I'm closer than you think. The phone slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor. My heart raced, the words echoing in my mind like a sinister chant. I stared at the phone, half expecting another message to appear, but the screen remained dark. Whoever they were getting closer. I wasn't safe. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in around me, the silence oppressive, suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a warning. I was trapped, alone, and powerless to stop whatever was coming for me. And in that moment, I realized the terrifying truth: the nightmare wasn't just beginning. It was already here. Story 6. It was a long day, and all I wanted was the quiet comfort of my apartment. But the moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. Darkness greeted me like a wall, heavy and oppressive. My hand instinctively reached for the light switch, but when I flicked it, nothing happened. The power was out. That was the first sign. The second sign hit me like a punch to the gut. My apartment, everything was wrong. Furniture wasn't where I'd left it. The couch, which had always been snug against the far wall, now stood awkwardly in the center of the living room. My coffee table was overturned, its contents scattered haphazardly. Bookshelves had been rotated, their books tossed about like discarded thoughts. I froze in the doorway, my breath caught somewhere between confusion and fear. The silence around me was unbearable, like the air itself was waiting for something. I took a cautious step inside, the sound of my shuffling feet breaking the suffocating quiet. The kitchen was no better. The dishes had been taken from their cabinets, stacked with eerie precision in the sink. It wasn't messy, it was deliberate. There was an order to the chaos that made my stomach churn. I hadn't had visitors, no one had a key, and I'd been gone all day. The idea that someone else had been here sent shivers down my spine. My pulse quickened as I ventured further in. Maybe I'd done this. Maybe I was losing my mind. Sleepwalking. Stress. My mind scrambled for answers, but deep down, I knew better. Something had happened here, something I couldn't explain. Then I reached my bedroom, and my breath hitched. The bed was stripped bare, the mattress shoved against the wall. The dresser drawers hung open, their contents spilled onto the floor. This wasn't just disorder, it was invasion. Someone, something, had rifled through my most personal space. I stared at the wreckage, my hands trembling, and tried to make sense of it. The door had been locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. How had anyone gotten in? I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the eerie scene. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing every unsettling detail. The air felt heavier here, like the walls were pressing in. The more I stood there, the more I felt, watched. As I turned to leave the bedroom, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the hallway mirror. My blood ran cold. I spun around, phone shaking in my grip, but the hallway behind me was empty. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum. Slowly, I looked back at the mirror, dreading what I might see. It was just my reflection, staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. But even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself to move, to shake the creeping fear. I checked the kitchen again, maybe there was a logical explanation. My footsteps felt unnaturally loud as I approached the source of the earlier sound. Just as I entered the room, a soft tapping noise echoed. It was faint, like fingernails drumming against the countertop. My heart felt like it might burst. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but nothing looked out of place. The dishes were still stacked, the counters spotless. Yet, the sensation of being watched was suffocating. Then I saw it. A single piece of paper tucked neatly beneath my coffee mug. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. The message, scrawled in precise handwriting, made my knees go weak. "I've been waiting for you." The paper slipped from my hands, fluttering to the floor. My mind reeled. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. Waiting for me. A cold wave of nausea swept over me, and my first instinct was to run, to get out of this apartment. But as I backed away from the kitchen table, a horrible realization settled over me. It was too late. Whatever had been here, was still here. I clutched my phone and dialed a friend. The sound of the ringing felt like a lifeline. Pick up, I whispered, my voice shaky. When they answered, their voice felt distant, like it was coming from another world. "Hello. I think someone's been in my apartment," I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I think I'm being watched." But before I could explain, the line went dead. My screen displayed, "Call ended," and I stared at it in disbelief. Then, the lights flickered once. Twice. And went out completely. The darkness around me felt alive, pressing against me from all sides. My breathing quickened as the oppressive silence returned, thicker than before. My flashlight beam quivered as I swept it across the room. Shadows seemed to shift and stretch, forming shapes just beyond the edge of the light. And then I felt it, that undeniable presence. I wasn't alone anymore. Something was waiting for me. And this time, it wasn't leaving. Story 7. I had just finished a long and grueling day, the kind that leaves exhaustion clinging to your very bones. The couch beckoned me like a sanctuary, and I collapsed into its embrace, letting my mind drift aimlessly. Then, my phone buzzed. The sharp vibration cut through my dazed thoughts like a knife, jolting me back to reality. At first, I assumed it was a notification, something trivial, maybe an ad or a reminder. But when I glanced at the screen, my heart stuttered in my chest. The message was short, almost deceptively simple. "I'm closer than you think." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. The sender's name was blank, no number, no contact, just a void where an identity should have been. My fingers hovered over the screen as dread began to creep into my veins. Maybe it was a prank, a stupid joke, I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. The words felt too deliberate, too precise. I checked the time. It was late, too late for games. The message gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, refusing to be dismissed. I stood, my legs shaky beneath me. The room felt different now, smaller, suffocating. The silence in the house wasn't comforting anymore. It was thick, heavy, and oppressive, wrapping around me like a shroud. Something compelled me to move to the window. I parted the curtain just enough to peer outside, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. But there was nothing, no movement, no figure lurking in the shadows. Just the stillness of the night. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a mistake. A wrong number, or someone pulling a cruel prank. But the words wouldn't leave me. "I'm closer than you think." They echoed in my mind, their weight growing heavier with every passing second. I turned away from the window, my unease bubbling into full-blown paranoia. The house, once my haven, felt alien. I checked the locks, twice, then 3 times, ensuring every door and window was secure. My heart pounded like a drum as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. Desperate for answers, I pulled up the feed from my home security cameras on my phone. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the footage. The outside cameras showed nothing but darkness and static. The images were distorted, as if something, or someone, had tampered with the signal. Then, as I rewound the footage, a single clear frame appeared. My breath caught in my throat. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the property, near the side of the house. It was distant, just far enough away that I couldn't make out the details. But the shape was unmistakable, human and eerily still. A wave of panic surged through me. Someone had been close. Someone was watching. I ran back to the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My eyes darted frantically across the yard, searching for the figure, but the space was as empty as before. The world outside seemed frozen in time, but I knew what I had seen. I slumped onto the couch, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Minutes felt like hours as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, the phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped it. This message was worse. "Look outside." My blood turned to ice. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to ignore it, to stay where I was. But I couldn't. My hand moved on its own, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. And there it was. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, shrouded in shadow but unmistakably there. It was perfectly still, as though frozen in time. I couldn't make out the details, but I could feel its eyes, boring into me, watching my every move. My heart hammered in my chest as cold sweat slicked my skin. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stumbled away from the window, my mind racing with questions and fears I couldn't untangle. Who was this person? How had they gotten so close without a sound? Why were they doing this? I dialed the police, my hands trembling as I relayed the situation. They assured me someone would be sent over immediately. But the wait felt eternal. I couldn't stop pacing, my eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. When the officers finally arrived, the figure was gone. The yard was empty, as if it had been swallowed by the night itself. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I never found out who sent those messages, who stood outside my home that night, or why they chose me. But even now, the memory lingers, of the figure, the messages, and the haunting realization that they were closer than I ever dared to think. Story 8. I had just finished cleaning up after a long, exhausting day, my mind still weighed down by the monotony of work and the endless cycle of to-dos. The house was calm, wrapped in the kind of silence I usually welcomed after hours of noise and chaos. It felt safe, familiar. I wandered toward the front door, a habit ingrained in me to check if I had locked it. But as I approached the door, something unusual caught my eye, a mark, dark and peculiar, right in the middle of the wood. I paused, staring at it, my tired brain trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't mud or a smudge from handling the door, it wasn't a scrape from moving furniture. No, this was something else. It was jagged, irregular, yet unnervingly smooth, as if someone had clawed at the surface with their bare hands, though the edges showed no sign of force. Cautiously, I reached out and brushed my fingers over it. The texture sent a chill up my arm, rough, cold, lifeless. There was no residue, no moisture, nothing that suggested it had just appeared. Yet, I was certain it hadn't been there earlier. I checked this door daily, sometimes multiple times a day. I would have noticed. My pulse quickened. Had I missed it somehow? Was it there when I moved in? My thoughts scrambled for answers, but no explanation made sense. The more I stared, the more unsettling it became. The mark seemed alive. It wasn't moving, not exactly, but my eyes kept playing tricks on me. It felt as though it pulsed, like it carried an energy I couldn't explain. I backed away, glancing out the window to see if someone, anyone, was outside. The street was still, bathed in the dim amber glow of the streetlights. No footsteps on the pavement, no shadows shifting in the dark. Everything looked as it should, yet nothing felt right. I told myself it had to be a prank. Maybe some teenager messing around. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something deliberate about this mark. Something purposeful. It felt as though it was trying to communicate, though the thought sent a cold knot tightening in my stomach. As I leaned in for one last look, I noticed the faintest scent hanging in the air, something metallic and acrid, like burning wood mixed with rusted iron. The smell clung to the back of my throat, and I stepped away, only for the sensation of pressure to suddenly settle around me. It wasn't physical, but it was there, a heavy, suffocating force, drawing me back to the door. I froze, my feet seemingly rooted to the floor. The mark didn't just feel alive anymore. It felt aware, as though it knew I was there, standing inches from it, trying to make sense of what I could never explain. I shook myself free of the trance, forcing my body to move. Lock the door, I thought. Just lock the damn door and go to bed. But as I reached for the key, the wood beneath my hand groaned. It wasn't the subtle creak of an old door, it was a deep, unnatural sound, like something alive and in pain. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The groaning stopped, but a new sound replaced it. A scratching. Faint at first, like a fingernail lightly dragged against wood. Then louder, more frantic. My heart thundered as I realized it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the other side of the door. I bolted for the back door, desperate to escape whatever was happening. But just as my hand gripped the cold metal handle, I heard it again, scratching, deliberate and unrelenting. And worse, it was moving. From the front door to the walls, as though circling the house, hunting me. I flung the back door open and ran into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. I made it to the neighbor's house, pounding on their door, praying someone would answer. But no one did. I turned back toward my house, the windows now dark except for a faint glow in the front hall. And through the glass of the front door, I saw it, a figure. Shadowed, distorted, and standing perfectly still. watching me. The next morning, I forced myself to return. My stomach churned as I approached the door, bracing for the mark, the scent, the scratches. But when I looked, the mark was gone. The wood was smooth, unblemished, as though nothing had happened. I ran my fingers over the spot where it had been, half expecting to feel that cold, rough texture again. But there was nothing. No evidence, no sign of the strange, suffocating presence from the night before. I wanted to convince myself it had all been in my head, that I'd imagined the entire thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the mark was real, and that it wasn't the last time I'd see it. Something had left it there for a reason. Something had been waiting on the other side of that door. And whatever it was, I knew it wasn't done with me yet. Story 9. The sound of my own voice echoed through the house, clear and unmistakable. My heart froze in my chest, and a cold, sharp chill washed over me. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. It wasn't some faint, distant noise that could be brushed off as the groan of an old house. It was my voice, as though I'd spoken just moments ago. The cadence, the inflection, even the subtle crack in the tone, it was mine. But it felt wrong, foreign, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I stood there in the oppressive silence, my breath hitching in my throat. "Hello." I called out, my voice trembling. The word felt like it was swallowed by the thick air around me, never to return. I waited, straining to hear even the faintest response. Nothing. Just an unbearable quiet that seemed to press against my ears. The house felt different now, smaller, darker, heavier. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity clawed at my resolve, forcing my feet to inch forward. Slowly, I crept toward the door leading to the next room, my hand trembling as it hovered over the knob. The polished metal was ice-cold under my fingertips. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, just as I had expected. Empty. Silent. Yet the air seemed alive, charged with a sinister energy I couldn't explain. I scanned every corner, every shadow. Nothing seemed out of place, but my gut told me otherwise. I took another cautious step inside, and then I heard it again. "Why are you standing there?" It was my voice, coming from behind me. Crystal clear. My body jolted as though I'd been shocked, and I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. But there was no one. Just the same dim hallway I had walked down moments before. My legs felt rooted to the ground, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The silence that followed felt unbearable, suffocating. My mind raced for answers, but none came. I was alone, or so it seemed. A sudden buzz in my pocket startled me, and I fumbled to pull my phone out. The screen lit up, but there were no notifications, no calls, no messages. Just the blank, familiar screen. The one thing I had counted on to feel normal now felt alien in my hands. Then, faint at first but growing louder, I heard it again. My voice. "Why don't you come closer?" The words seemed to seep out of the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I spun wildly, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It wasn't just in one place anymore, it was everywhere. "I'm waiting," it taunted, louder now, more persistent. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan. My feet carried me down the hallway as my heart pounded like a drum. The voice followed, growing louder with every step I took. It wasn't just calling to me, it was closing in. The words grew twisted, sinister, as though they were meant to unravel me. "You're already here. You've always been here." The front door was just ahead. Salvation. I reached out, fingers brushing the handle, but my heart sank as the knob refused to turn. Locked. "Don't leave yet." The voice was no longer everywhere, it was right behind me. Low, cold, and unmistakably mine. Slowly, I turned, every muscle in my body trembling. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was me, or something that looked like me. The same height, the same shape. But its eyes, they glowed faintly, an unnatural, sickly light that made my stomach churn. Its smile was wide, too wide, stretching across its face in a way no human face should move. The figure stepped closer, each movement slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. My body refused to move. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, trapped under its unrelenting gaze. It stopped just a few steps away, and in that voice, that horrible, distorted echo of my own, it said, "I've been waiting for you to wake up." The word struck me like ice, freezing every thought, every breath. The world around me seemed to distort, the edges of my vision blurring as though I were being pulled into a nightmare I couldn't escape. Finally, my legs obeyed. I bolted toward the door, desperation fueling every step. My hands fumbled with the lock, pounding against the unyielding wood. "Let me out!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The echo of my own cries mocked me, bouncing off the walls. "I've been waiting," the voice repeated, relentless and cold. I turned, expecting to see the figure again, but the hallway was empty. Just the thick, suffocating silence and the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Then, as though in mockery of my despair, the door behind me creaked open, the sound slicing through the stillness. I didn't hesitate. I fled into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap, pulling me back into reality. My legs didn't stop moving until I reached the street. My chest heaved as I turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see that thing standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. Just the empty, silent house, its windows dark and uninviting. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the shadows, it came again. That voice, my voice, soft, almost a whisper. "I'm waiting." Story 9. I woke up to the unsettling buzz of my phone, the kind of wake-up call that felt wrong from the start. The screen lit up with a strange, cryptic message, "I'm waiting for you to wake up." My heart skipped a beat, frozen for a moment as I stared at the words, the hairs on the back of my neck standing tall. It wasn't from anyone I knew. No name, no number, just that chilling line. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the fog of sleep, but the words refused to leave my mind. They echoed in my head, spinning in circles. I glanced around the room, half expecting something, anything, to seem out of place. But the room was quiet, still. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of the clock on the wall, a soft but maddening reminder of the normalcy that should have been. Everything was just as it should be, or so I thought. But the message clung to me, like a whisper brushing against my ear. I opened the text, searching for some clue, some explanation, but there was nothing. No sender's name, no phone number, just that unnerving message. "I'm waiting for you to wake up." The words seemed oddly personal, like the sender knew exactly what time I had just woken up, like they had been standing there, waiting for the precise moment I would stir from sleep. My mind raced. Could I have gotten this while I was asleep? But who would send such a thing? No one had my number like that, no one knew when I woke up, or at least, no one should have. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, the air suddenly thick, like something was pressing down on me. I checked my phone's notifications again, desperate for some explanation, but there was nothing. No missed calls. No new messages. Only the one. The phone seemed to freeze for a moment, like the screen was hesitating, reluctant to let me read any further. But there was no stopping me. I scrolled back to the message again, searching for some hidden meaning, anything that could explain it. There was nothing. Just that same line, "I'm waiting for you to wake up." A chill ran down my spine. The minutes dragged on, stretching unnaturally, and I could feel something in the room change. The quiet was deafening. Every creak of the floor, every tick of the clock, sounded too loud. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked to the window. The world outside was eerily still. No birds, no distant car hums, nothing. It was like the neighborhood was holding its breath, frozen in time. I pulled the curtains shut, trying to force the unsettling thought out of my mind, but the message refused to let me go. It clung to me, replaying itself in my head over and over. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who could I trust with something so strange? It felt like I was trapped in some twisted dream, and the more I thought about it, the more disconnected from reality I felt. I glanced at the message one last time, my fingers trembling as I held the phone. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. And then, just as I thought I might have imagined it all, the phone buzzed again. My heart stopped. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I unlocked the phone with shaking hands. A new message had arrived. You should have been here earlier. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. What did that mean? I looked around the room, my eyes darting nervously from corner to corner, a growing sense of dread tightening in my chest. Something was watching me. I could feel it, lurking just beyond my line of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? How could I explain something so bizarre without sounding insane? I needed to know where these messages had come from. I scrolled through my texts, searching frantically for any sign of where the messages had come from, but there was nothing. No one I knew had texted me. The number was unfamiliar. I tried calling it, but the call wouldn't connect, as if the number didn't even exist. Panic gripped me as I tried again, but the result was the same. It was like I was being toyed with, forced to confront something I couldn't understand. And then it hit me. The messages weren't just random. They were a countdown. The first one had come the exact moment I woke up. And now, the second, you should have been here earlier, suggested something had already happened. A terrible thought crept into my mind. What if the message wasn't meant for me to wake up? What if it was meant for me to stay asleep? I rushed to the door, tearing it open, hoping to find some sign of normality. But outside, everything was eerily quiet. The world felt suspended in time. The house was silent. The usual hum of life had vanished, leaving nothing but a heavy stillness that pressed against my chest. I made my way down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was dead silent, the only sound the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. As I entered the living room, my eyes landed on the coffee table, and my blood turned to ice. There, on the table, lay a third message, not on my phone this time, but written in messy, spidery handwriting, scrawled across a piece of paper. It read, "I told you I was waiting." I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The handwriting matched the message from my phone. But I hadn't written it. I hadn't seen anyone in the house. My hands shook violently as I picked up the paper. The ink was still fresh, still wet, as if the words had been written moments ago. Whoever had sent those messages had been in my house. They had been waiting for me to wake up. My mind spiraled. Maybe this was a cruel prank, some elaborate joke. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This wasn't a joke. This was something else. Something much worse. I looked around the room, the walls closing in on me. The air grew colder, heavier, and I could feel something shifting, something moving just beyond my reach. The door was right there, but as my hand grasped the handle, the lights flickered. The air grew icy, and a soft whisper brushed against my ear. "I've been waiting." I whipped around, but the room was empty, just as it had been before. Yet, the presence lingered, thick in the air. It was as if someone, or something, was standing right behind me, watching, waiting. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was waiting for me, it knew I had finally woken up. Story 10. The hum of static greeted me as I awoke, faint and steady, filling the room with a peculiar sense of unease. The early morning light barely seeped through the curtains, leaving the room in shadows. My radio was on, though I didn't recall turning it on before I went to bed. It felt oddly comforting at first, the soft sound breaking the silence. But then something about it struck me as wrong. The station wasn't playing its usual repertoire of songs or morning chatter. This was something different. At first, it sounded like a conversation, soft, intimate, as if meant for someone else entirely. I assumed it was a late-night interview, some rerun being aired. But the more I listened, the more unsettling it became. The voices, one of them was unmistakably mine. I froze, my pulse quickening as I strained to hear the exchange. It wasn't just my voice, it was my words. Words I didn't remember speaking, memories I couldn't place. The conversation played out like a scene from someone else's life, yet it was mine. And then there was the other voice, calm, low, and unnervingly familiar. "You've been thinking about it," the stranger said, their tone gentle but heavy with meaning. "You just don't want to admit it." My breath hitched, and I sat up in bed. The words seemed directed at me, like they had pierced through time and space to find me in this exact moment. But I hadn't been thinking about anything like that, or at least, I didn't think I had. I wanted to turn off the radio, to stop hearing this uncanny exchange, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. The voices carried on, their words growing sharper, more pointed, as though they were aware of my presence, aware that I was listening. The stranger laughed, a soft, knowing chuckle that sent chills racing down my spine. "You'll remember soon enough," they said. I felt sick. The words lodged themselves in my mind, clawing at something buried deep within me. What was I supposed to remember? What was it they thought I'd forgotten? My hands trembled as I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky as I crossed the room to the radio. The conversation grew louder, more urgent. I reached for the volume dial, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but the sound refused to fade. It was as if the radio had a life of its own, a malevolent will keeping it alive. "You need to come back," the stranger's voice demanded now, their tone laced with urgency. "It's been too long." My stomach churned as the words echoed in my mind. Come back where? I didn't know the voice, but it felt like I should. And though I wanted to turn it off, to make it stop, I couldn't help but feel as if they were speaking directly to me, as though this wasn't just a recording but a conversation happening in real time, only I wasn't part of it. With a surge of panic, I yanked the radio's plug from the wall. The room fell into silence, so thick and oppressive it felt deafening. I stood there, clutching the radio in my trembling hands, the stranger's words still ringing in my ears. What had I just heard? And why did it feel like those voices had pulled something loose in my mind, something I wasn't ready to confront? My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in the dark, my mind drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. It wasn't just a random broadcast. It couldn't have been. That conversation, those words, had been meant for me. But why? And what was I supposed to remember? The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, but the echoes of the voices lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion, something I couldn't outrun. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And the terrifying part was, deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream.